While organizing medical records, I found a file that shouldn't exist. My own death certificate from 1987. According to the hospital's records, Harlow Miller had died of complications during surgery, but I was Harlow Miller, and I was very much alive. The question was, who was the woman buried under my name? My name is Harlow Miller, and I'm 62 years old. For the past 3 years, I've been volunteering at Chicago General Hospital, spending my Tuesday and Thursday mornings helping the overwhelmed medical records department organize patient files. It wasn't glamorous work, but after 35 years as a high school English teacher, retirement had left me with too much time and too few purposes. The hospital gave me somewhere to be useful. I'd always been meticulous about organization, a trait that had served me well in the classroom and made me invaluable to the records department. That's why I noticed immediately when something was out of place in the filing system. It was a Thursday morning in October when I was working through a box of archived files that needed to be digitized. Most were routine: discharge summaries, surgery reports, medication charts from decades past. But one manila folder caught my attention because it was misfiled. Instead of being in chronological order, it was stuck between files from 1989 and 1985. I opened it to check the date and correct the filing error. That's when I saw my own name staring back at me from an official Cook County death certificate. Harlow Elizabeth Miller. It read in bold letters across the top. Date of death, September 15th, 1987. Cause, complications from cardiac surgery. Place of death, Chicago General Hospital. I stood there in the quiet records room, holding the document with hands that began to shake. According to this certificate, I had died 36 years ago at the age of 26. But I was very much alive, standing in the same hospital where I had supposedly died, looking at what appeared to be my own death certificate. My first thought was that there had been some clerical error, that another woman with the same name had died and somehow my information had been mixed up with hers. But as I studied the document more carefully, the details became increasingly unsettling. The birth date was correct, March 12, 1961. The Social Security number matched mine exactly. Even my mother's maiden name was listed correctly as Washington. I sat down heavily in the nearest chair, my legs suddenly unsteady. How could there be a death certificate with my exact information? I thought back to 1987, trying to remember what I had been doing in September of that year. I would have been 26, fresh out of graduate school, just starting my teaching career at Lincoln High School. I'd been young, healthy, with no history of heart problems. I'd never had cardiac surgery in my life. The more I stared at the document, the more questions flooded my mind. Who had signed this certificate? Why did it exist? And most disturbing of all, if someone had died using my identity, where was their real identity? What had happened to make this elaborate deception necessary? I noticed there were additional pages clipped to the death certificate. Surgery notes signed by Dr. Robert Chen. The handwriting was meticulous, detailing a procedure that lasted over 6 hours, complications that arose during surgery, and ultimately the patient's death from cardiac arrest at 11:47 p.m. Reading those medical notes felt surreal, like reading someone else's detailed account of my own death. The patient described in those notes had arrived unconscious with no identification, suffering from what appeared to be drug-induced cardiac distress. She had been approximately my height and weight with similar physical characteristics. But it wasn't me. It couldn't be me. "Harlow, you look like you've seen a ghost." I looked up to see Margaret Chen, the head of medical records, standing in the doorway with a concerned expression. Margaret was a kind woman in her 50s who had been working at the hospital for over 20 years. She'd been the one to welcome me as a volunteer and had always treated me with patience and respect. "Margaret," I said, my voice coming out shakier than I intended, "I need to ask you about this file." I handed her the death certificate, watching her face carefully for any sign of recognition or explanation. She studied it for a moment, her brow furrowing with confusion. "This is very strange," she said slowly. "Where did you find this?" "It was mixed in with the 1987 files." "Margaret, that's my name. Those are my personal details, but I'm obviously not dead." Margaret looked at me, then back at the certificate, then at me again. "Are you sure these details are yours? I mean, it's possible there was another Harlow Miller with the same birth date, the same social security number, the same mother's maiden name." I shook my head. "Margaret, this is impossible, but it's definitely supposed to be me." Margaret walked to her computer and began typing rapidly. "Let me check our current system for any records under your name." After a few minutes of searching, she turned back to me with an even more puzzled expression. "Harlow, this is very odd. Our computer system shows no record of you ever being a patient here. Not in 1987, not ever. But this death certificate appears to be legitimate. It has the proper signatures, the official seal. Everything looks authentic." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What does that mean?" "I'm not sure. Let me make some calls." Margaret picked up her phone and dialed an extension. "Dr. Harrison, it's Margaret in records. I have a situation I need your help with. Could you come down to the records room? Thank you." While we waited for Dr. Harrison, I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Had someone stolen my identity to fake a death? But why would someone do that in 1987 before identity theft was common? And how would they have gotten such detailed personal information? I found myself studying the signature on the death certificate more closely. Dr. Robert Chen's signature was bold and confident, but there was something about it that seemed forced, as if he had been reluctant to sign. Below his signature was another I didn't recognize, a coroner's signature that looked almost illegible.
"Margaret," I said suddenly, "you mentioned Dr. Chen. Is he still working here?" Margaret's expression grew sad. "No, Dr. Chen was my uncle. He passed away in 1995. But I remember him well. He was one of the most ethical doctors I've ever known. He took every patient's death personally, especially the young ones." This revelation made the mystery even deeper. If Dr. Chen had been an ethical man, why would he have signed a death certificate for someone using false identity? Unless he hadn't known it was false. Dr. Harrison arrived 10 minutes later. He was the chief of staff, a distinguished man in his 60s, who I'd seen around the hospital but never spoken to directly. Margaret explained the situation and showed him the death certificate. "This is highly unusual," Dr. Harrison said after examining the document. "Margaret, can you pull up the surgery logs from September 1987? If this death certificate is legitimate, there should be corresponding surgical records." Margaret returned to her computer and spent several minutes navigating through archived databases. "Here," she said finally, "September 15th, 1987, emergency cardiac surgery performed by Dr. Robert Chen. Patient, Harlow Miller. Status, deceased. Complications during surgery led to cardiac arrest." "Dr. Chen?" I asked. "Is he related to you, Margaret?" Margaret nodded grimly. "He was my uncle. He died in 1995, so we can't ask him about this case directly, but I remember him mentioning this surgery to my family. It was one of the cases that haunted him. A young woman who died on his table during what should have been a routine procedure."
Dr. Harrison was studying the records on Margaret's computer screen. The surgical notes are here, and they're quite detailed. According to Dr. Chen's report, the patient, Harlow Miller, was brought in with acute cardiac distress. Emergency surgery was performed, but the patient went into cardiac arrest and could not be resuscitated. As Dr. Harrison read the surgical notes aloud, I felt increasingly disturbed. The woman described in those notes had been brought in unconscious, with no identification, showing signs of drug overdose. She had been alone, with no family or friends asking about her. It was as if she had been completely disposable, someone whose disappearance wouldn't be noticed or investigated. "But that's impossible," I said. "I've never had heart problems. I've never had surgery at this hospital. I was 26 in 1987, and I was teaching school. I would remember having major surgery." Dr. Harrison looked at me intently. "Ms. Miller, I need to ask you some personal questions. Do you have any memory gaps from that time period? Any periods where you might have been unconscious or hospitalized elsewhere?" I thought back carefully to 1987. It had been an important year for me, my first year teaching, the year I'd moved into my own apartment, the year I'd started dating Marcus, who would later become my husband. "No," I said firmly. "I have clear memories of that entire year. I was never hospitalized. I was never sick." Have you ever gone by any other names? Had your identity changed legally for any reason? No, I've been Harlow Miller my entire life. Well, until I got married in 1990 and became Harlow Johnson, but I've always used Miller professionally. Dr. Harrison and Margaret exchanged glances. "Miss Miller," Dr. Harrison said carefully, "I think we need to involve hospital administration in this. What you've discovered raises some serious questions about our record keeping and possibly about what happened in 1987. Over the next hour, we were joined by the hospital's chief administrator, the head of security, and a representative from the legal department. They examined the death certificate, reviewed the surgical records, and asked me dozens of questions about my personal history. The legal representative, a sharp-eyed woman named Julia Santos, seemed particularly interested in the timing of events. "Miss Miller, you said you started teaching in September 1987. Do you have any documentation from that period? Pay stubs, employment records, anything that would prove you were alive and working during that time?" "I should have my old tax returns at home, and I kept all my teaching evaluations from my first year. I was so proud of them." "We'll need to see those," Julia said, "because if you were officially declared dead in September 1987, there could be significant legal implications. Insurance claims, Social Security records, even your teaching certification could be affected." This was a terrifying thought. What if my entire professional life, my pension, my Social Security benefits, were all built on what was technically a fraudulent foundation? What if I had been legally dead for 36 years without knowing it? The administrator, Dr. Patricia Williams, leaned forward. "Miss Miller, I want you to understand the gravity of this situation. If there really was a death certificate issued using your identity, we're looking at potential fraud, identity theft, and possibly conspiracy. But we're also looking at the possibility that someone, another woman, died alone and was buried under a false name." The facts, as far as we could establish them, were these. According to hospital records, a woman named Harlow Miller, with my exact personal information, had died during cardiac surgery on September 15, 1987. A death certificate had been issued, signed by Dr. Chen and the coroner. But I was obviously alive, with no memory of ever being a patient at the hospital. "There are several possible explanations," Dr. Williams said after our lengthy discussion.
One is that there was a clerical error somewhere along the line, that another patient's information was confused with yours. Another possibility is that someone used your identity fraudulently. A third option. She paused, looking uncomfortable. What's the third option? I asked.
The third option is that there was some kind of cover-up in 1987, that someone wanted it to appear that Harlow Miller had died for reasons we don't understand. Julia Santos leaned forward. Miss Miller, we're going to need to investigate this thoroughly, but in the meantime, I need to ask, are you certain about your identity? Is there any possibility that you were adopted, that your birth records were altered, anything that might explain this discrepancy? I shook my head. I was raised by my biological parents, James and Ruth Miller. I have birth records, school records, employment records going back decades. There's no question about my identity. But, Margaret said slowly, if someone else died using your identity, we need to figure out who that person was, and more importantly, why they had access to your personal information. Dr. Harrison stood up. I'm going to make some calls. If there really was a cover-up in 1987, there might be other people who remember what happened. Dr. Chen kept detailed personal notes about his cases. They might be in his estate. As the meeting broke up, I found myself alone with Margaret in the records room. She looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and concern. Harlow, are you all right? This must be incredibly unsettling. I nodded, though I wasn't sure unsettling was strong enough to describe how I felt. Margaret, can I ask you something? Your uncle who performed the surgery, what kind of man was he? Uncle Robert was a good man, very ethical. He took every patient death hard, especially when it was someone young. He used to say that losing a patient was like losing a piece of his own soul. So he wouldn't have been involved in any kind of cover-up? Margaret considered this carefully. Not willingly, but if someone in authority had told him that a patient's identity needed to be protected for some reason, witness protection maybe, or some kind of government program, he might have gone along with it if he thought he was helping. That afternoon, I drove home to my small house on the south side, my mind reeling with questions. I'd lived in the same neighborhood for over 20 years, raised my daughter there, been part of the community. But now I was wondering if everything I thought I knew about my life was somehow wrong. The first thing I did when I got home was go to my home office and pull out my filing cabinet. I kept meticulous records, a habit from my teaching days, and I was sure I could find documentation that would prove I had been alive and working in 1987. I found my 1987 tax return first. There it was, clear as day. Wages from Chicago Public Schools filed under my Social Security number, dated April 15, 1988. I had definitely been alive and working as a teacher in 1987. Next, I found my teaching evaluations from my first year. My principal, Mrs. Rodriguez, had written glowing reviews of my performance. The evaluations were dated throughout the 1987-1988 school year, including one from October 1987, a month after I had supposedly died. But as I continued searching through my files, I found something that made my blood run cold. My original teaching contract from Chicago Public Schools was missing. I clearly remembered signing it and keeping a copy, but it wasn't in my files. In its place was a contract dated 6 months later, in March 1988, as if I had been hired mid-year. I called my daughter, Ashley, who was 31, and lived in Atlanta with her husband and 2 children. I wasn't sure how to explain what I'd discovered without sounding like I was having some kind of breakdown. "Mom, you sound stressed," Ashley said immediately. "What's wrong?" "Honey, I need to ask you about our family history, about your grandparents, about my childhood. Do you remember anything unusual about the stories I told you?" "What do you mean, unusual?"
I mean, did I ever mention being in the hospital when I was young or having any kind of surgery? Anything about missing time or memory problems? Ashley was quiet for a moment. Mom, this is a weird question. You've always said you were healthy as a horse. You used to brag about never missing a day of school, never being sick. Why are you asking? I decided to tell her the truth. Ashley listened without interrupting as I explained about finding the death certificate and the hospital records. When I finished, there was a long silence.
Mom, she said finally, that's impossible. You were at my school play in October 1987. I remember because it was right after my 7th birthday, and you brought that chocolate cake you always made. You couldn't have died in September and been at my play in October. You're sure about the date? Positive. I have the program saved in my baby book. You wrote on it, Ashley's first starring role, October 15th, 1987. This was proof that I had definitely been alive in October 1987, a month after the supposed death date, but it didn't explain who had died in my place or why my identity had been used. That evening, I called my sister, Carmen, in Los Angeles. Carmen was 3 years older than me and had always been the keeper of family history. If anyone would know about strange events in 1987, it would be her. Carmen, I need to ask you about something that happened in 1987. Do you remember me being sick or having any medical problems that year? 1987. Harlow, that was the year you disappeared for 2 weeks and wouldn't tell anyone where you'd been. I felt my heart stop. What do you mean, disappeared? You don't remember? In September, you called and said you were going out of town for work, some kind of training or conference. But when I tried to call the hotel you'd given me, they said they'd never heard of you. Mom was worried sick.
I gripped the phone tighter. Carmen, I don't remember going anywhere in September 1987. What happened when I came back? You acted like nothing had happened. When I asked you about the training, you got angry and said it was confidential. You seemed different, thinner, maybe? And you had this bandage on your chest that you said was from a minor accident. The bandage on my chest. I suddenly had a vague memory of something, not of surgery, but of pain, of being careful not to move too quickly, of wearing loose clothing to hide something. But the memory was hazy, like trying to remember a dream. Carmen, did I ever explain where I'd really been? No, and I eventually stopped asking. But Harlow, why are you bringing this up now? That was almost 40 years ago. I told Carmen about the death certificate, about the surgical records, about the impossible situation I'd discovered at the hospital. Like Ashley, she listened in stunned silence. Harlow, she said when I finished, I think you need to be very careful. If someone faked your death in 1987, there was a reason. And if you start digging into it now, you might not like what you find. But I have to know the truth. Someone died using my identity. Don't I owe it to that person to find out who they were?
Maybe, but you also owe it to yourself and to Ashley to stay safe. Promise me you'll be careful. That night, I lay awake thinking about the 2 weeks Carmen said I'd disappeared. I tried to force my memory to recall what had happened in September 1987. There were fragments. The sense of being in a place that smelled like disinfectant, voices speaking in low tones, the feeling of being very tired, but nothing concrete, nothing that made sense. I also thought about the missing teaching contracts. If someone had needed to create a new identity for me after whatever had happened in September, they might have needed to recreate my employment records as well. But that would mean that someone with significant resources and authority had been involved in covering up whatever had happened to me. The next day, Dr. Harrison called me at home. Miss Miller, I've been making some inquiries. I spoke with Dr. Chen's son, who still has his father's personal files. He's agreed to let us look through them to see if there are any additional notes about the Harlow Miller case.
We arranged to meet at Dr. Chen's son's house that afternoon. David Chen was a lawyer in his 50s who had inherited his father's medical papers and kept them in a climate-controlled storage room in his basement. He led us to a wall of filing cabinets and pulled out a thick folder labeled September 1987. My father was very thorough, David explained. He kept detailed notes on every case, especially the difficult ones. This folder contains his personal observations about every patient he treated that month. Dr. Harrison opened the folder and began leafing through handwritten pages. "Here it is," he said after a few minutes. "September 15th, 1987, Harlow Miller, age 26. He read silently for several minutes, his expression growing increasingly troubled. Finally, he looked up at me with an expression I couldn't interpret. "Miss Miller, according to Dr. Chen's notes, the woman who died was not originally identified as Harlow Miller. She was brought in unconscious with no identification. The name Harlow Miller was provided by a federal agent who came to the hospital after she died." "A federal agent?" "Agent Sarah Rodriguez from the FBI. According to Dr. Chen's notes, Agent Rodriguez said the woman was part of a witness protection program and that her identity needed to remain classified. She provided the personal information that was used on the death certificate." David Chen had been listening intently. "That explains something I never understood. My father mentioned this case to me years later, said it was one of the strangest situations he'd ever encountered. He said a government agent had made him sign a confidentiality agreement about the case." "What kind of confidentiality agreement?" Dr. Harrison asked. "The kind that said he could never discuss the details of the surgery or the patient's identity with anyone, even other medical professionals. He said it was a matter of national security."
I felt dizzy. Are you saying that the FBI used my identity to create a fake death certificate for someone in witness protection? It looks that way, Dr. Harrison said grimly, but that would mean that somehow the FBI had access to your detailed personal information in 1987, and it would explain why there's no record of you ever being a patient here, because you aren't. Someone else was, but they used your identity after she died. David Chen was looking through more of his father's files. "There is something else here," he said, pulling out a sealed envelope. "My father left specific instructions that this envelope should only be opened if someone ever came asking about the Harlow Miller case." Dr. Harrison took the envelope and carefully opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief handwritten note. "If anyone is reading this, it means the truth about the Harlow Miller case is finally coming to light. The woman who died was not Harlow Miller. The real Harlow Miller was part of an FBI operation that I was not fully informed about. I was told that her cooperation was essential to national security, but I suspected then and believe now that she was not a willing participant. There were signs of recent medical procedures that suggested she had been used for tissue and blood sampling." Dr. Robert Chen, 1995. The room fell silent as we absorbed the implications of Dr. Chen's note. Not a willing participant, recent medical procedures, tissue and blood sampling. The pieces were starting to form a horrifying picture.
"Dr. Harrison," I said quietly, "I think I need to contact the FBI. I think you're right. But Miss Miller, I want you to understand that once you start down this path, there may be no going back. If you were involved in some kind of federal operation in 1987, there were probably good reasons why the details were kept secret. Maybe, but I have a right to know what happened to me. And if someone died because of it, their family has a right to know who they were." That evening, I called the FBI field office in Chicago and asked to speak to someone about a case from 1987. After being transferred several times, I was finally connected to Agent Michael Torres, who specialized in cold cases and historical investigations.
Agent Torres, I said, my name is Harlow Miller, and I need to report that someone used my identity to fake a death certificate in 1987. I believe it was connected to an FBI operation. There was a long pause. Miss Miller, can you hold on for just a moment? I was put on hold for nearly 10 minutes. When Agent Torres came back on the line, his tone had changed completely. Miss Miller, I'm going to need to meet with you in person to discuss this matter. Are you available tomorrow morning? Yes, but can you tell me what this is about?
Not over the phone, but I can tell you that your name appears in some very old and very classified files. We'll need to talk. The next morning, I met Agent Torres at the FBI field office in downtown Chicago. He was a serious man in his 40s who looked like he'd been handling difficult cases for a long time. He led me to a small conference room and closed the door. Ms. Miller, before we begin, I need to verify your identity. He asked me a series of questions about my personal history, my family, my work background. Finally satisfied, he leaned back in his chair. What I'm about to tell you is information that has been classified for 36 years. The reason it's remained classified is that it involves an ongoing investigation into government corruption that has never been fully resolved. Government corruption? In 1987, the FBI was investigating a network of corrupt officials in Chicago who were involved in everything from drug trafficking to murder for hire. We had identified several key witnesses who were willing to testify, but their lives were in danger. Agent Torres opened a thick file folder. One of those witnesses was a young woman named Maria Gonzalez. She had worked as a secretary for a law firm that was laundering money for the criminal network. She had evidence that could bring down the entire operation. What does this have to do with me?
Maria Gonzalez looked remarkably similar to you. Same height, same build, same general appearance. When she was murdered before she could testify, we needed to make it appear that she had died under a different identity to protect the investigation. I felt sick. So you used my identity? Not exactly. We approached you to ask for your cooperation. You agreed to let us use your personal information for Maria's death certificate in exchange for certain considerations. What considerations? Agent Torres hesitated. According to the file, you were facing some legal troubles at the time, drug possession charges that could have ruined your teaching career. In exchange for your cooperation with our operation, those charges were dropped and expunged from your record. I stared at him. That's impossible. I've never used drugs. I've never been arrested. The charges were filed under a different name, one of several aliases you were using at the time. Aliases? Agent Torres, I think you have me confused with someone else. I've never used aliases. I've never been in trouble with the law. Agent Torres looked confused. He flipped through several pages in the file. According to our records, you were recruited as an informant in early 1987. You provided information about drug activities in the school where you worked. In exchange, we protected you from retaliation and helped you create a new identity when the situation became too dangerous.
A new identity? Agent Torres, I've been Harlow Miller my entire life. I taught at the same school for 35 years. I've lived in the same neighborhood for decades. What new identity are you talking about? Agent Torres was looking increasingly uncomfortable. Miss Miller, I think there may have been some confusion in our files. Let me make some calls and get back to you. But as he reached for his phone, I remembered something Carmen had told me about the 2 weeks I disappeared. About coming back different, thinner, with a bandage on my chest. About acting like nothing had happened. Agent Torres, I said slowly, what if the woman you recruited wasn't me? What if someone else was using my identity before Maria Gonzalez died? He stopped dialing and looked at me intently. What do you mean? What if there were two women using the name Harlow Miller in 1987? The real me and someone else who was working with the FBI. And when Maria Gonzalez was murdered, you used the identity of the woman who was already working with you, not knowing that there was a real Harlow Miller out there. Agent Therese set down the phone and opened the file again, this time studying it more carefully. The photos, he said after a moment. The FBI file contains several surveillance photos of our informant. They're not very clear, but he showed me the photographs, and I felt my blood run cold. The woman in the pictures looked like me, but it wasn't me. Similar height, similar build, but her face was different. Sharper features, different hair, a small scar on her chin that I didn't have. Agent Torres, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I think someone stole my identity in 1987 to become an FBI informant. And when she was murdered, you used that same stolen identity to fake Maria Gonzalez's death. But who would steal your identity? And how would they have gotten such detailed personal information? I thought about the 2 weeks Carmen said I'd disappeared, about the vague memories of being in a hospital-like setting, about the bandage on my chest when I returned. Agent Torres, I think I need to tell you about 2 weeks in September 1987 that I can't remember clearly. Over the next hour, I told Agent Torres everything I could recall about that strange period in my life. The more I talked, the more concerned he looked. Ms. Miller, based on what you're telling me, I think you may have been the victim of a crime. If someone drugged you, stole your identity documents, and then used that information to create a false identity for FBI cooperation, that would be kidnapping and identity theft at minimum. And if they performed some kind of medical procedure on you during those 2 weeks, Agent Torres didn't finish the sentence, but I understood what he was implying.
The bandage on my chest, you think they took something from me? Blood, tissue samples, something that would help them impersonate me? It's possible. In 1987, DNA testing was just becoming available to law enforcement. If someone wanted to create a very convincing false identity, they might have needed biological samples. The implications were staggering. Not only had someone stolen my identity, but they had apparently kidnapped me and performed medical procedures without my consent to make the impersonation more convincing. Agent Torres, I want to know who did this to me. I want to know who the woman was who died using my identity, and I want to know who was responsible for kidnapping me. Miss Miller, I understand your anger, but this investigation involves some very dangerous people. The corruption network we were investigating in 1987 was never completely dismantled. Some of the people involved are still alive and still powerful. Are you saying I should just forget about this? That I should accept that someone kidnapped me, stole my identity, and used it to cover up multiple murders? Agent Torres was quiet for a long moment. I'm saying that if we reopen this investigation, we need to be prepared for the consequences. The people involved have spent 36 years covering their tracks. They won't hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatens to expose them. But you'll help me find the truth? I'll help you find the truth. But Miss Miller, once we start down this path, your life is going to change forever. Are you prepared for that? I thought about my quiet retirement, my peaceful routine of volunteering at the hospital and visiting my grandchildren. I thought about the comfortable life I'd built based on what I now knew was an incomplete understanding of my own past. Agent Torres, For 36 years, I've been living with a gap in my memory and a nagging feeling that something important was missing from my life. If someone used me and then tried to erase the evidence, I need to know. Not just for my sake, but for the sake of the woman who died using my name. All right, Agent Torres said, closing the file. Let's find out what really happened in September 1987. The investigation that followed was unlike anything I could have imagined. Agent Torres assembled a team of federal investigators who specialized in cold cases and government corruption. They interviewed retired FBI agents, reviewed decades-old surveillance files, and tracked down witnesses who'd been in hiding for 36 years. What they uncovered was a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Chicago law enforcement and city government. The corruption network the FBI had been investigating in 1987 had included judges, prosecutors, police chiefs, and even some federal agents. When the investigation had threatened to expose their activities, they had systematically eliminated witnesses and buried evidence. But the most shocking revelation came when we learned the identity of the woman who had stolen my identity. Her name was Sarah Kim, and she hadn't been working with corrupt federal agents. She had been working with a legitimate FBI investigation, but she had her own agenda.
Sarah Kim was a professional con artist, Agent Torres explained during one of our regular briefings. She had been living under false identities for years, running various scams across the Midwest. When the FBI approached her about becoming an informant, she saw an opportunity. An opportunity for what? To disappear completely. She was being hunted by some very dangerous people. Not law enforcement, but criminals she had swindled. She needed a new identity that would be completely clean with no connection to her past. So she kidnapped me to steal mine? It appears that way. Sarah Kim had been watching you for months, learning your routines, studying your background. When she discovered that you lived alone and had recently started a new job, she saw the perfect opportunity. Agent Torres showed me surveillance photos that had been found in Sarah Kim's apartment after her death. There were dozens of pictures of me, going to work, shopping for groceries, walking in my neighborhood. She had been stalking me for months before she made her move. The kidnapping was sophisticated, Agent Torres continued. She drugged you at a coffee shop near your school, then took you to a private medical facility that was being run by corrupt doctors. They kept you sedated while they collected blood samples, tissue samples, even dental impressions. Why did they need all that? Because Sarah Kim wanted to be able to pass any medical or forensic tests that might be required if her false identity was ever questioned. She was planning for the long term. The private medical facility had been shut down years ago, but Agent Torres's team had found records that detailed what had been done to me during those 2 weeks. It was horrifying to read about the procedures that had been performed on my unconscious body, all to enable someone else to steal my life. But something went wrong with Sarah Kim's plan, Agent Torres explained. She had been working as an FBI informant for several months when the corrupt network discovered that she was also trying to play both sides. They realized she was gathering information not just for the FBI, but for her own purposes. What happened to her? She was murdered, just like Maria Gonzalez. But by then, she had been using your identity for so long that when the FBI needed to create a false death certificate for Maria, they automatically used the identity that Sarah Kim had been using, which was yours. The full picture was finally becoming clear, but it was more horrifying than I had imagined. Not only had my identity been stolen, but it had been used to cover up multiple murders, and I had been victimized by both criminals and law enforcement without ever knowing it. So the woman buried under my name is actually Maria Gonzalez, I asked.
Yes, and Sarah Kim's body was never found. She was probably dumped in Lake Michigan after she was killed.
but the corrupt network made sure that both murders were covered up by using your stolen identity. Agent Torres showed me more files that his team had uncovered. The corruption network had been extensive, involving dozens of people across multiple agencies. They had been running drug trafficking operations, money laundering schemes, and elimination services for other criminal organizations. The most disturbing part, Agent Torres said, is that some of these people are still alive and still active. When you discovered that death certificate, you inadvertently threatened to expose a conspiracy that some very powerful people have spent decades protecting. Are you saying I'm in danger now? I'm saying we need to be very careful about how we proceed. These people have killed to protect their secrets before, and they won't hesitate to do it again. Over the following weeks, Agent Torres's investigation expanded dramatically. They discovered that the private medical facility where I had been held had been used for other illegal activities, not just identity theft, but human trafficking, illegal drug testing, and organ harvesting. The facility had been run by Dr. Marcus Webb, a disgraced surgeon who had lost his medical license for conducting unauthorized experiments. Dr. Webb is still alive, Agent Torres told me during one of our briefings. He's in his 70s now, living in Florida under an assumed name. But we've been watching him, and we believe he still has contacts with the criminal network.
Can we arrest him? We're building a case, but we need more evidence, and we need to be sure we can protect you and your family before we make any moves. The psychological impact of learning all this was enormous. I had to accept that I had been the victim of a serious crime, that my trust in institutions had been betrayed, and that dangerous people had manipulated my life without my knowledge or consent. But I also had to process the fact that a woman named Maria Gonzalez had been buried under my name, and that her family had never known what happened to her. Agent Torres arranged for me to meet with Maria's sister, Elena, who lived in California. "Mrs. Johnson," Elena said when we met at the FBI office using my married name, "I can't thank you enough for bringing this to light. My family has spent 36 years not knowing what happened to Maria." Elena was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair. She looked tired, as if she had been carrying a heavy burden for decades. "Maria was trying to do the right thing," Elena continued. "She had discovered that her boss was involved in criminal activities, and she wanted to report it. But she was scared, and she didn't know who to trust." "What happened to her?"
She disappeared one night in September 1987. We never heard from her again. The police said she had probably run away, that young women sometimes just left to start new lives somewhere else. But we knew Maria would never do that. She would never leave without telling us. Elena pulled out a photograph of Maria, a young woman with dark hair and a bright smile. She did look remarkably similar to how I had looked at that age. When the FBI told us that Maria had been murdered and that someone else had been buried under a false name, it was devastating. But it was also a relief to finally know the truth. "I'm so sorry," I said. "I wish there was something I could do to make up for all the years your family spent not knowing." "You've already done it," Elena replied. "By finding that death certificate, by pushing for answers, you've given us closure. Maria can finally have a proper burial with her real name." Agent Torres had been working with the coroner's office to arrange for Maria's body to be exhumed and properly identified. It was a complex process, but DNA testing confirmed that the woman buried under my name was indeed Maria Gonzalez.
There's something else, Agent Torres said after the DNA results came back. We found additional evidence at the burial site, objects that had been buried with Maria that shouldn't have been there. What kind of objects?
Personal items that belong to Sarah Kim. It looks like whoever killed them both buried Sarah's belongings with Maria's body to eliminate evidence. This discovery led to another breakthrough in the investigation. Among Sarah Kim's personal items was a small notebook containing names, dates, and locations that provided a roadmap to the entire corruption network. Sarah Kim had been documenting everything, Agent Torres explained. She was planning to use this information for blackmail, but it's turned out to be the key to solving cases that have been cold for decades. The notebook led to the arrest of 12 people, including several who were still in positions of power: a former police chief, 2 retired federal agents, a sitting city councilman, and several businessmen who had been involved in the money laundering operations. But the investigation also revealed something that shook me to my core. My own teaching job in 1987 hadn't been a coincidence. The corruption network had been targeting specific schools in Chicago, Agent Torres explained. They needed teachers and administrators who could be compromised or coerced into helping with their operations. What do you mean? They were using schools as distribution points for drugs. Students from certain families were being recruited as dealers. Teachers who discovered what was happening were either bought off or eliminated.
You think they targeted me specifically? We think Sarah Kim was placed at your school to monitor you and determine whether you could be useful to them. When they decided you were too honest to be corrupted, Sarah Kim was ordered to eliminate you and take your identity. This revelation was almost too much to bear. Not only had I been victimized, but my entire career, the thing I had been most proud of, had been built on a foundation of criminal manipulation. But you survived, Agent Torres reminded me, and you built a life that mattered. You taught thousands of students over 35 years. You made a difference in their lives, regardless of how you got that job originally. As the investigation continued, more details emerged about the extent of the corruption network. They had been involved in dozens of murders over the years, had corrupted officials in multiple states, and had laundered millions of dollars through various businesses and organizations. The most important thing, Agent Torres said, is that your courage in pursuing this case has finally brought them down. Without you finding that death certificate and refusing to let it go, these people would have continued operating indefinitely. The trial phase was grueling. I had to testify multiple times, recounting my kidnapping, the theft of my identity, and the impact it had had on my life. It was painful to relive those experiences, but I knew it was necessary for justice to be served.
Miss Miller, the prosecutor said during my main testimony, can you tell the court how it felt to discover that you had been declared dead 36 years ago? It felt like my entire life had been built on a lie, like someone had stolen not just my identity, but my sense of who I was and where I belonged in the world. And how has learning the truth affected you? It's been difficult, but it's also been liberating. For 36 years, I had this feeling that something was missing from my life. Now I understand what it was. It was the truth about what had been done to me. The defense attorneys tried to argue that their clients had been acting in good faith, that they had believed they were participating in legitimate law enforcement operations. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the jury saw through their attempts to shift blame. All 12 defendants were convicted on multiple charges, including conspiracy, murder, money laundering, and violation of civil rights. The sentences ranged from 25 years to life in prison. Dr. Marcus Webb, the surgeon who had run the illegal medical facility, received the harshest sentence, life without the possibility of parole.
At his sentencing, he finally admitted what he had done to me and to other victims. I was paid to perform procedures without consent, he said in a barely audible voice. I knew it was wrong, but the money was too good to refuse. I'm sorry for what I did to Miss Miller and to the other victims.
His apology felt hollow, but it was still acknowledgement of what had been done to me. After 36 years, someone had finally admitted that I had been wronged. The psychological healing process was long and difficult. I worked with a therapist who specialized in helping victims of government misconduct and identity theft. She helped me understand that the trauma I had experienced was real and valid, even though I hadn't fully understood it at the time. Your body and mind remembered the trauma, even when your conscious mind couldn't, she explained. That's why you always felt like something was missing, why you never felt completely settled or secure. Working through those feelings was painful, but it was also necessary. I had to grieve for the young woman I had been before the kidnapping, for the innocence and trust that had been stolen from me. But I also had to learn to appreciate the strength and resilience that had carried me through 36 years of living with incomplete knowledge of my own experience. 1 year after discovering my own death certificate, I was invited to speak at a conference for victims' rights advocates. Standing at the podium, looking out at an audience of people who had also survived serious crimes, I felt a sense of purpose that I had never experienced before. My name is Harlow Miller, I began, and for 36 years, I was legally dead without knowing it. But I want you to know that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about finding the courage to seek truth and justice, even when that truth is painful. I told my story to that audience, and I could see recognition in many faces. There were other people who had experienced government misconduct, other victims of identity theft, other survivors of crimes that had been covered up or ignored. The most important thing I've learned, I concluded, is that it's never too late to demand answers. It's never too late to fight for justice. And it's never too late to reclaim your own story. After my speech, I was approached by several other survivors who wanted to share their own experiences. A woman whose son had been killed by corrupt police officers, a man whose business had been destroyed by a money laundering scheme, an elderly couple who had been forced from their home by a fraudulent foreclosure. Each of their stories was different, but they all shared common themes: the abuse of power, the covering up of crimes, the silencing of victims. But they also shared something else: the determination to keep fighting for truth and accountability. I began working with victims' advocacy organizations, helping other people navigate the complex process of seeking justice for historical crimes. My experience with the FBI investigation and the court system gave me insight that could be valuable to other victims. The system is designed to discourage people from pursuing these cases. They make it complicated and expensive and time-consuming because they hope you'll give up. But if you persist, if you refuse to let them bury the truth, you can win. 2 years after discovering my death certificate, I received a call that changed everything again. It was Agent Torres, and his voice was excited. "Harlow, we found Sarah Kim's body." "Where?" "Lake Michigan, just like we suspected. But that's not the important part. The important part is what we found with her." Construction workers dredging the lake bottom had discovered human remains along with a waterproof container that had preserved its contents for over 30 years. Inside the container were documents that provided even more evidence about the corruption network, including financial records and communication logs that implicated additional people who had never been investigated. "This could lead to a whole new round of prosecutions," Agent Torres explained. "People who thought they had gotten away clean are about to be exposed."
The discovery of Sarah Kim's body also provided closure for her family, who had been wondering what happened to her for decades. Despite the crimes she had committed, she had also been a victim of the corruption network that had ultimately killed her. As I reflected on everything that had happened since that October morning when I found my own death certificate, I realized that my life had been divided into two distinct phases: before the truth and after the truth. Before the truth, I had been living a half-life, carrying the unconscious burden of trauma I didn't understand. I had been successful in many ways, as a teacher, as a mother, as a community member, but I had always felt incomplete, always felt like something was missing.
After the truth, I had to confront painful realities about what had been done to me. But I also found a sense of purpose and power that I had never experienced before. I discovered that my voice mattered, that my story could make a difference, that survival could be transformed into service. My relationship with my daughter Ashley had grown stronger through this process. Initially, she had been angry that I had never told her about the missing 2 weeks in 1987, even though I hadn't consciously remembered them. But as she learned more about what had happened to me, her anger turned to admiration. "Mom, I'm proud of you for not giving up," she told me during one of our phone calls. "You could have just accepted the official story and moved on with your life. Instead, you fought for the truth." "I fought for Maria Gonzalez, too," I reminded her, "and for all the other victims who never got justice." That's exactly what I mean. You turned your own pain into something that helped other people. My sister Carmen also had to process the fact that she had witnessed my trauma without understanding what was happening. She felt guilty for not pushing harder for answers when I'd returned from those missing 2 weeks, acting strange and withdrawn. "I should have known something was seriously wrong," she told me. "I should have made you go to the police or a doctor."
You couldn't have known, I assured her. The people who did this to me were professionals. They knew how to cover their tracks and make their victims complicit in their own silence. Carmen and I grew closer as we worked through these issues together. She became one of my strongest supporters in the advocacy work I was doing, helping me research cases and connect with other victims. The neighborhood where I had lived for over 20 years also had to adjust to the revelation that one of their quiet, unassuming residents had been at the center of a major federal conspiracy case. Most of my neighbors were supportive, but some were uncomfortable with the attention the case had brought to our community. "It's not that we don't believe you," one neighbor told me, "but it's hard to accept that all this cloak and dagger stuff was happening right here in our quiet little neighborhood." I understood their discomfort, but I also knew that corruption and crime don't respect neighborhood boundaries. The criminals who had targeted me had chosen our area precisely because it seemed safe and unremarkable, the perfect place to hide their activities. 3 years after discovering my death certificate, I was invited to testify before a congressional committee that was investigating historical cases of government misconduct. Sitting at the witness table in a room full of senators and representatives, I felt the weight of responsibility to speak not just for myself, but for all the victims who had never gotten the chance to tell their stories. "Mr. Chairman," I began, "my case illustrates the devastating impact that government corruption can have on ordinary citizens. When law enforcement agencies are compromised, when institutions designed to protect us are turned against us, the damage extends far beyond the immediate victims. I spent 2 hours answering questions about my experience, about the investigation that had followed, and about the systemic reforms that were needed to prevent similar cases in the future." "What would you say to other victims who might be hesitant to come forward?" one senator asked.
I would say that the truth has power, even when it's been buried for decades. I would say that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied. And I would say that every voice matters, every story has value, every victim deserves to be heard. The committee's final report included several recommendations for reform, including better oversight of FBI informant operations, stricter controls on the use of false identities, and improved protections for victims of government misconduct. Your testimony was instrumental in shaping our recommendations, the committee chairman told me after the report was released. Your courage in pursuing this case has helped ensure that other people won't have to go through what you experienced. As I entered my 4th year of living with the truth about my past, I found myself in a place I had never expected to be. I was 66 years old, officially retired from teaching, but busier than I had ever been. I was traveling around the country, speaking at conferences, working with victims' advocacy groups, and consulting with law enforcement agencies on cold cases.
My story had been featured in news articles, documentary films, and academic studies about government corruption. I had become, somewhat reluctantly, a public figure, the face of survival and justice. But most importantly, I had found peace. The nagging sense that something was missing from my life had finally been resolved. I knew who I was, what had happened to me, and why my life had taken the shape it had. I still lived in the same house on the south side of Chicago, still volunteered at the hospital, though now in the patient advocacy department rather than medical records. I still visited my grandchildren in Atlanta and maintained the friendships I had built over decades. But now I also had a broader community, fellow survivors, advocates, investigators, and journalists who were working to expose corruption and support victims. I had found my tribe, my purpose, my voice. Maria Gonzalez had been reburied in California with her real name on her headstone. Her family had finally been able to hold a proper funeral and begin the process of grieving properly. Elena and I had become friends, bonded by our shared experience of seeking truth and justice. Sarah Kim had also been laid to rest, with a small ceremony attended by the few family members who could be located. Despite the crime she had committed, she had also been a victim of the system that had ultimately destroyed her. On the 6th anniversary of finding my death certificate, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee and the morning newspaper, reading about yet another case of government corruption being exposed. The work was far from over. There were still secrets to be uncovered, still victims waiting for justice, still institutions that needed to be reformed. But I was no longer afraid. I was no longer living in the shadow of something I couldn't name or understand. I had reclaimed my identity, my story, my power. My name is Harlow Miller, and I am 68 years old. For 36 years, I was officially dead without knowing it. For 6 years, I have been more alive than I ever imagined possible. Sometimes the most important discoveries are the ones we make about ourselves. Sometimes the truth that sets us free is the truth we never wanted to know. And sometimes the greatest victory is not in avoiding the darkness, but in finding the courage to bring light to places where others have tried to hide the truth. The woman buried under my name finally had her real identity restored. The criminals who had stolen my life were behind bars. The corruption network that had operated in shadows for decades had been exposed and dismantled. But perhaps most importantly, I had learned that survival is not just about enduring. It's about transforming pain into purpose, trauma into truth-telling, victimization into advocacy. I was no longer just Harlow Miller, the retired teacher who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. I was Harlow Miller, the survivor,
who had refused to let her story be buried, who had fought for justice not just for herself, but for all the other victims whose voices had been silenced.
In the end, finding my own death certificate had led to something I had never expected, finding my life's true purpose. And that, perhaps, was the most important discovery of all.